Hello and welcome back to Rock Records Reviewed. My name's Adam, and this week we're going to take a look at the 5 studio albums recorded by The Police. The Police formed in London in 1977 at the height of punk, which was one of the big influences on their music. It was of course Sting on bass guitar and vocals, Andy Summers on lead guitar, and Stuart Copeland on drums. The three of them were sort of quite seasoned professionals by the time they got together. Sting had played in jazz fusion band Last Exit. Andy Summers had been in a previous generation of players from the 60s and played even with Eric Burdon and the Animals at one point. He'd been playing in a band called Gong, and Stuart Copeland had been in Curved Air. Stuart's brother Miles Copeland was also the manager of the band. Famously, a band of personalities that clashed quite a lot, particularly Sting with everybody else. He's known to be something of an acquired taste as a person, but undoubtedly a huge talent. They went from being this sort of punky band in the 70s to possibly the biggest band in the world by the time they broke up in 1983. A lot of people regard the Police as something of a singles band. You could argue that they didn't often make completely satisfying albums. There was always something about them which was I think it's because a lot of their singles are brilliant. They spend a lot of time crafting and putting these wonderful singles together, and then some of the other songs on their albums are quite filler like and often a bit half baked. It sounds like they could have sat down and spent a little bit more time finishing them off. But let's discuss it as we go along. So 5 albums, and let's get into it. In 5th place from 1980, I'm going to put their 3rd album, Zenyatta Mondata. Their first 2 albums had been getting more and more successful, particularly the second one. So by the time this one came out, the record company was quite excited and they could smell the money. So they rushed the Police off to Holland for tax reasons to record it rather. You can kind of hear that. You know what I was saying about half-baked songs and things that you wish they'd spent more time finishing. There are 2 absolutely killer singles on this record, and there always are on Police albums. Absolutely killer singles. We've got Don't Stand So Close to Me and Dee Doo 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 Dee Da Da Da. 2 absolutely huge hits. The rest of the album, well, look, there's a couple of instrumentals, including Behind My Camel by Andy Summers, which Sting absolutely hated. In fact, he hated it so much he nicked the demo and buried it in the garden. But they still ended up recording it, but Sting didn't play on it. Andy Summers played bass on it. You've got Bombs Away, which was developed from an old Susie and the Banshees backing track, believe it or not. The lyrics here, Sting is starting to write about a few things outside of Boy Meets Girl. There's some songs about the political world around him. I quite like Canary in a Coal Mine and Driven to Tears, but there's not a great deal else on this record, I think, that bears repeated listening. In 4th place, I'm going to put their 2nd album, Regatta de Blanc from 1979. If the first album was a real punky album, this is a real kind of punk reggae album. You can hear that particularly in something like The Bed's Too Big Without You, which is the very definition of punk reggae. Stuart Copeland is playing the rim shots loads, and there's his fantastic cymbal work all over this record. I think the hooks aren't quite as fun on this album. Some of it, quite frankly, is a little bit dreary. You do have, of course, again, those fantastic singles. You've got Message in a Bottle, which was their first #1 single, and you've also got Walking on the Moon. This was their first #1 album, particularly in the UK. Among the deep cuts on here, which I do think are very good, something like Bring on the Night, which I think is a lovely track. Before we carry on, the Police aren't one of those great bands where you've got that fantastic mix of players. Only the really great bands has that chemistry where you've got Stuart Copeland's amazing drummers, absolutely one of the very best drummers there is in rock music, and Sting's attack on the bass and that tremendous voice of his, and then Andy Summers with his classical influence and his famously out of tune guitars. And all the great rock bands just have that chemistry of musicians where they just come together and make a wonderful and unique sound. But in 3rd place, we will put from 1982 their fourth album, Ghost in the Machine. This was recorded in Air Studios in Montserrat, and this is a moodier, more grown-up record than the ones we've seen before. But straight away the sound has changed. The album opens with a synth riff, and there's horns on this album, and this didn't please Andy Summers at all. He was thinking, well, why are we doing this? I can play these parts on the guitar. We don't need synths and horns everywhere. That doesn't sound like the Police. And I think it caused an awful lot of friction, which carried over into their final album. Once again, the album opens with some fantastic songs. You've got Spirits in the Material World, Every Little Thing She Does Is Magic, and Invisible Sun. Invisible Sun is a song about the troubles in Northern Ireland, and again hinting at Sting's ever-growing ambition lyrically as a songwriter. The sound has changed. The writing's more considered. There's a whole song in French on here, which I'm not sure is that necessary. This album does often make a lot of the best sort of 500 albums of all time. I'm not so sure. I think this is, again, goes back to that point I made earlier that, did the Police really often make a completely satisfying record? I'm not sure this is it. Omega Man was originally going to be one of the singles. That's not a bad track. And Demolition Man is pretty good. That was covered by Grace Jones and Manfred Mann. But in number 2, I'm going to put their first album, Outlandos Damour, from 1978. This is we were talking about debut albums recently. This is one of those cracking debut albums. You can hear the band chomping at the bit, and they just bash straight into it with Next to You, one of my favourite Police songs. There's energy, there's life, there's cheekiness, there's humour, there's passion, there's youthfulness, all those things that make debut albums great. And then they go into So Lonely, which is a famous Police track, despite the horrendously out of tune guitars. And then they absolutely smash it out of the park with Roxanne. Roxanne is still to this day, I think, probably one of Sting's signature tunes, and one of the very, very greatest pop rock songs ever written, arguably. The interesting thing about this album, they had already recorded this album and paid for it themselves before A&M came in for them. So when A&M came in for them, they said, look, we've already recorded the album, so you don't have to pay anything. So there's no risk here for you at all. Why don't you instead give us a higher royalty rate? And that proved a very, very shrewd move, because of course they went on to sell millions of records, and they made millions and millions of pounds in the process. Born in the 50s is a great song. Be My Girl is absolutely ludicrous song with a spoken word section about a blow-up doll. Interesting or mildly diverting story about the Police from this stage. One of my old producers was on set at Top of the Pops in 1978 when they played it for the first time, and passed this guy in the hallway backstage, and this guy was in a big jumpsuit and had big sunglasses on and peroxide blonde hair, and my producer just looked up at him and just went, oh my god, this guy is going to be a superstar. And of course it was Sting, and indeed he did. So there you go. There's just charisma is something you just can't buy. So the Police's number 1 album, you probably won't be surprised to know I've made it Synchronicity from 1983, their 5th album. This was number 1 on both sides of the Atlantic. It was Rolling Stone's Album of the Year. It's constantly in all sorts of best albums lists, and it won loads and loads of Grammys. And unsurprisingly, because it's a very, very well-made record. You can hear that the band, the production, songwriting, the arrangement has all gone up another level. It sounds a much, much more sophisticated record than they've made before. The 4 killer singles this time. You've got Synchronicity 2, Wrapped Around Your Finger, King of Pain, and Every Breath You Take, of course, which has become a pop rock standard. It's a much more considered, crafted record, and you can hear Sting's songwriting ambitions really now starting to be bigger than the band. Really, you can hear he's almost bursting out with ideas here. There's far less filler than we've had before. Tea in the Sahara is a lovely song. Andy Summers' Mother is kind of crazily enjoyable, even though Sting hated it. There's that running theme between the musicians there. And this is really a world away from the sort of fun punk energy of their first album. And by the time they get to the last track, Murder by Numbers, you can almost hear Sting metaphorically slamming the door behind him as he leaves the police and embarks on an absolutely stratospherically successful solo career. So that's my rundown of the Police's 5 studio albums. I'm not sure you'll disagree. I think if you listen back to them, it's kind of obvious. Maybe the top two, if you prefer the punky, youthful energy of the first one, might replace the last record. Interesting, quite similar to some other bands, most notably off the top of my head, The Doors, another band who made their best records at the very beginning and end of their career. The beginning when they had all that sort of again that pure youthful charisma that a band has, and then it develops and eventually writes a more mature record by the end of their career. So there's a parallel there that's literally just occurred to me as I say it. But if you don't agree with them, please do say so in the comments below and let's discuss it. But I will be back before too long with another episode of Rock Records Reviewed. So until then, thank you very much for watching. Bye.